November 12, 1985, 2:17 a.m., Vienna, Austria. The Café Landmann sits dark on the Ringstrasse, its ornate windows reflecting street lamps that cast pools of amber light across wet cobblestones. Inside, a single figure occupies a corner booth, positioned where he can see both entrances. Major Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko drinks Turkish coffee that has gone cold. He wears a gray wool coat, Western-made, purchased 3 days earlier at a shop on Kartnerstrasse. His left hand rests on a leather attaché case, fingers drumming a pattern, 3 short, 2 long, that matches no signal protocol in any intelligence manual. Outside, the temperature hovers at 4 degrees Celsius. Light rain falls, the kind that doesn't cleanse, but simply makes everything slick. A black Mercedes sedan idles 2 blocks away, diplomatic plates barely visible in the darkness. Inside sit 2 CIA officers who have not slept in 36 hours. They smoke Marlboros and watch the cafe entrance through rain-streaked windows. The older officer, stationed in Vienna for 11 years, has conducted 17 defector handoffs. None felt like this. Yurchenko checks his watch. A Poljot, Soviet-made, the second hand sweeping past the 12. He has been sitting here for 43 minutes. The meeting was scheduled for 1:30 a.m. The Americans are late, or they are watching, or they have decided he represents unacceptable risk. In the attaché case rest 247 pages of KGB internal documentation, personnel files, active operation summaries, surveillance photographs, and a complete organizational chart of Directorate K, the Counterintelligence Division responsible for hunting CIA officers operating in Soviet territory. He has carried these documents for 16 days, sewn into the lining of a different coat, then transferred to this case in a pension room in Zurich where he didn't sleep, only waited for footsteps in the hallway that never came. The cafe door opens. A woman enters, shaking rain from an umbrella. She is alone. She orders nothing. She sits 3 tables away, opens a newspaper, the International Herald Tribune, yesterday's edition, and begins to read. Yurchenko's fingers stop drumming. The woman wears a blue scarf, arranged loosely, the ends tucked inside her coat collar in a way that looks casual, but isn't. This is the signal. But the signal was supposed to come from a man. Something is wrong. The official story, as it would be reported in Western newspapers 15 days later, presented a straightforward Cold War defection narrative. A senior KGB officer, disillusioned with Soviet leadership, walks into the U.S. Embassy in Rome on August 1, 1985, and requests asylum. He brings with him devastating intelligence on KGB penetrations of American intelligence services. He identifies 2 catastrophic moles: Ronald Pelton, an NSA analyst who sold communications intelligence secrets, and Edward Lee Howard, a CIA officer who betrayed Moscow station operations. The defection represents a major intelligence coup. Yurchenko receives a new identity, a comfortable resettlement, and the gratitude of a nation he supposedly chose over his own. Both sides believed different versions of this story in the autumn of 1985. CIA leadership, particularly Director William Casey and Deputy Director for Operations Claire George, saw Yurchenko as the most significant Soviet defector since Oleg Penkovsky in 1961. His bona fides appeared impeccable. 15 years in the KGB's first chief directorate, most recently serving as deputy chief of the 5th Department, which monitored and recruited Western intelligence officers. He had operated in Washington, D.C. in the late 1970s, working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet Embassy, where he successfully identified and reported on FBI counterintelligence methods. The information he provided about Pelton and Howard checked against existing suspicions, offered specific details that only an insider could know, and led to arrests that validated his credibility. The KGB, monitoring the situation through sources in European capitals, initially assessed Yurchenko as a legitimate loss, a defection born from personal crisis rather than ideological conviction. Yurchenko's mistress, the wife of a Soviet diplomat, had refused to leave her husband and follow him to the West. This rejection, combined with professional disappointment over a posting to Rome rather than a more prestigious assignment, created the emotional vulnerability that Western intelligence services exploited. KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov ordered a complete security review of all operations Yurchenko had touched. 43 cases underwent immediate reassessment. 17 field officers received emergency recall orders. The damage appeared substantial, but containable. What was at stake extended beyond individual careers or compromised operations. By 1985, the Cold War intelligence contest had reached a state of desperate mutual penetration. Both sides had achieved deep access to each other's most sensitive programs. The CIA ran operations inside Soviet military research facilities. The KGB had sources in American weapons laboratories. Each side knew the other had penetrated its ranks, but couldn't determine how deeply. Trust had eroded within agencies to the point where officers suspected colleagues, where polygraph tests became routine, where paranoia functioned as operational security. Yurchenko's defection threatened to expose this precarious equilibrium. If he possessed comprehensive knowledge of KGB penetrations of Western services, and his position suggested he did, then the entire architecture of American counterintelligence might require reconstruction. Every Soviet source the CIA believed secure might be compromised. Every operation might be controlled by Moscow. The strategic implications reached into nuclear deterrence, arms control negotiations, and the fundamental calculation of power that prevented direct military confrontation. Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko was born March 2, 1936, in a village outside Leningrad. His father served as a mid-level Communist Party administrator, loyal enough to survive Stalin's purges, competent enough to advance through regional bureaucracies. Yurchenko attended Leningrad State University, studying foreign languages with particular focus on English. He demonstrated the qualities Soviet intelligence recruiters valued: intelligence without brilliance, ambition without recklessness, loyalty expressed through discipline rather than ideology. In 1959, at 23, he received the invitation that would define his life: an interview with a representative from the Committee for State Security. His KGB career followed a careful trajectory: initial assignments in domestic counterintelligence, monitoring foreign diplomats in Moscow, language training at the KGB's Red Banner Institute, postings to Western capitals under diplomatic cover, first Ottawa, then Washington. He proved skilled at the patient work of intelligence, recruiting sources, managing dead drops, maintaining cover over years of methodical operation. Colleagues described him as thorough, cautious, occasionally cold. He married, had a daughter, maintained the appearance of a dedicated Soviet officer living abroad in service to the motherland. But something changed during his Washington posting from 1975 to 1980. He met Svetlana Dedkova, the wife of a Soviet embassy colleague, and began an affair that violated every security protocol. The relationship continued after both returned to Moscow, conducted through clandestine meetings that required the same tradecraft he used against Western targets. When Svetlana's husband received a posting to Canada and she chose marriage over romance, Yurchenko's carefully constructed emotional control began to fracture. CIA officers who debriefed him in the months after his defection noted this fracture. Thomas Hanna, the Soviet division officer who served as Yurchenko's primary handler, wrote in a classified assessment dated October 1985. Subject demonstrates psychological fragility, inconsistent with his operational record. He speaks of Svetlana with obsessive focus, often redirecting debriefing questions toward this personal grievance. When pressed on technical intelligence matters, he provides accurate information, but appears emotionally disengaged, as if reciting facts rather than betraying cause. Recommend psychological evaluation before public acknowledgement of defection. The recommendation went unheeded. Casey wanted immediate exploitation of Yurchenko's intelligence to roll up KGB networks and demonstrate CIA effectiveness to congressional oversight committees. The Howard and Pelton cases offered prosecutable espionage with the potential for public trials that would validate counterintelligence efforts. The defection couldn't wait for Hannah's psychiatric concerns. Colin Thompson, the CIA officer who managed Yurchenko's initial debriefing in Rome, saw different warning signs. In a cable to Langley marked Critic, the highest priority classification, Thompson reported, "Defector maintains possession of personal effects to unusual degree, refuses secure facility accommodation, insists on hotel lodging where he can control access to his belongings, has declined to surrender a leather case he carried from Moscow, claiming it contains only personal letters. When pressed, became agitated, threatened to withdraw cooperation, granted temporary exemption from standard security protocol. Recommend immediate review." That leather attaché case, purchased in a Moscow shop on Gorky Street 3 months before his defection, traveled with Yurchenko from Rome to Frankfurt to Washington to the CIA safe house in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It sat beside his bed during debriefing sessions, accompanied him to meetings with FBI agents investigating the Pelton case, remained within reach during the carefully staged press conference where he denounced Soviet oppression. No CIA officer ever examined its contents. What the attaché case actually contained would not become clear until November 2, 1985, when Yurchenko walked out of a Georgetown restaurant where he was dining with a CIA security officer, claiming he needed to visit a restroom, and never returned. The security officer, following protocol, waited 15 minutes before initiating emergency procedures. By then, Yurchenko had entered a taxi, spoken in Russian to the driver, a coincidence that CIA investigators would later determine was actually coincidence, and directed him to the Soviet embassy compound on Wisconsin Avenue. But before that dramatic restaurant exit, before the international embarrassment and the counterintelligence panic, the real operation was already in motion. The operation Yurchenko had been running, not for the CIA against the KGB, and not for the KGB against the CIA, but for himself against both. Declassified KGB documents released in 2003 by the Mitrokhin Archive reveal that Yurchenko never intended permanent defection. Starting in April 1985, he began a methodical process of duplicating sensitive KGB files to which his position granted access. He used a Monox camera to photograph documents during late-night sessions in the 5th Department archives, storing the film in a false bottom of his attaché case. The photographs documented KGB operations across 3 continents, detailed the identities of Soviet illegals operating under deep cover in NATO countries, and included financial records showing payments to recruited Western sources. But Yurchenko wasn't gathering this material for the Americans. A separate set of documents, released by Russian intelligence in 2017 as part of a historical transparency initiative, reveals his true objective: leverage. Yurchenko planned to defect temporarily, provide enough legitimate intelligence to establish credibility, then negotiate his return to the Soviet Union from a position of strength. The attaché case contained his insurance policy, documentation of KGB operations that the CIA had not yet discovered, which he could offer back to Moscow in exchange for immunity from prosecution and a comfortable retirement. The plan required extraordinary precision. He needed to convince the CIA he was genuine while avoiding providing so much information that Moscow would consider him irredeemable. He needed to maintain access to the case while appearing cooperative enough to avoid intensive scrutiny. And he needed to time his return before the CIA's debriefing process reached the point where his incomplete knowledge would reveal that he had held back critical intelligence. Technical details of his methodology emerged from NSA intercepts of internal KGB communications, declassified in 2009. Yurchenko established a schedule for his defection based on 3 criteria. First, he needed to defect shortly before a scheduled KGB internal security audit would discover the missing files. Second, he needed sufficient time in American custody to provide the Howard and Pelton intelligence, which he had been authorized by a secret KGB faction to reveal as part of a larger disinformation operation, while maintaining the fiction of fuller cooperation. Third, he needed to return before the CIA completed its planned polygraph examination, scheduled for mid-November, which would ask specific questions about withheld information. The disinformation dimension added another layer of complexity. A cabal of senior KGB officers, including First Deputy Chairman Viktor Grushko, had authorized Yurchenko to sacrifice Howard and Pelton. Both men had become counterintelligence liabilities. Howard's alcoholism made him unpredictable. Pelton's financial desperation would eventually lead to his exposure. By using Yurchenko to reveal them, the KGB accomplished three objectives. It removed problematic assets. It convinced the CIA that Yurchenko was providing devastating intelligence, and it concealed deeper penetrations that remained active and productive. A memorandum from Grushko to KGB Chairman Chebarkov, dated March 15, 1985, and released by Russian historians in 2015, makes the strategy explicit. Yurchenko operation will sacrifice two compromised sources to protect three irreplaceable ones. CIA will celebrate intelligence victory, will trust defector completely, will miss opportunity to question deeper penetrations, recommend approval of operation with extraction contingency after 90 days. The three irreplaceable ones remained classified in the released documents, their identities redacted. CIA counterintelligence analysts who studied the material concluded that at least one operated at senior levels within American intelligence until the mid-1990s. The others may still be active, or died with their betrayals undiscovered. Yurchenko's chess game required him to play both sides against the middle, while maintaining a third position. Nobody suspected existed. He met with CIA debriefers and provided accurate intelligence on KGB structure, methodology, and current operations, enough to prove his knowledge was comprehensive. He identified Howard and Pelton with specific details that led to their exposure, cementing his credibility. He described KGB recruitment techniques, surveillance methods, and communications protocols in technical depth that FBI counterintelligence specialists found invaluable. But he also withheld. He claimed ignorance of KGB operations in certain regions where his position would have granted him direct knowledge. He described the structure of certain departments incompletely, leaving gaps that suggested he had been compartmented from information he had actually possessed. He provided dates that were accurate, but timelines that were subtly wrong, creating confusion about when certain operations had been active or dormant. Thomas Hanna, his primary CIA handler, noticed these inconsistencies, but attributed them to memory failure or psychological trauma. In a report dated September 22, 1985, Hanna wrote, "Subject shows remarkable recall for operations connected to his personal history, but demonstrates significant gaps for operations he managed administratively. This pattern suggests psychological blocking related to his defection decision. He appears to separate his identity as intelligence officer from his identity as defector, creating cognitive dissonance that manifests as selective memory. Recommend continued patient engagement rather than aggressive interrogation." Colin Thompson, reviewing Hanna's assessments from CIA headquarters, reached different conclusions. In a back-channel communication to Claire George, Thompson wrote, "Yurchenko's memory gaps follow pattern too precise to be psychological. He forgets specific operations while remembering administrative details of same departments. He provides documentation that checks as authentic, but avoids operational intelligence that would require ongoing verification. Recommend intensive polygraph on question of withheld information before further intelligence dissemination." The disagreement between Hanna and Thompson reflected a larger split within CIA's Soviet division. One faction, led by officers who had invested years in developing Soviet sources, wanted to believe Yurchenko represented a breakthrough. A senior KGB officer so disillusioned with the Soviet system that he brought genuine intelligence as an act of ideological conversion. Another faction, hardened by decades of KGB deception operations, suspected that Yurchenko's defection served Moscow's purposes in ways not yet apparent. Director Casey sided with the believers. He needed a victory. The CIA had suffered a series of counterintelligence failures, including the 1984 defection to the Soviets of agency officer Edward Lee Howard, whose betrayal Yurchenko would later reveal. Congressional oversight committees questioned CIA effectiveness. The Reagan administration demanded results that could be presented as evidence of American intelligence superiority. Yurchenko provided that narrative. Meanwhile, Yurchenko lived in a comfortable safe house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, protected by CIA security officers who monitored his movements, but allowed him relative freedom. He requested and received Western clothing, American cigarettes, English-language newspapers. He watched television, particularly news broadcasts covering Soviet-American relations. He asked about Svetlana Dedkova's whereabouts, whether she might be convinced to defect and join him. CIA officers pursuing this possibility contacted her in Moscow through circuitous channels, received polite but firm refusal, decided not to push further for fear of compromising Yurchenko's security. What they didn't realize, what the declassified documents reveal, was that Yurchenko had no expectation of Svetlana joining him. His inquiries about her served as emotional cover for his temporary defection, reinforcing the narrative of a man driven by romantic obsession rather than strategic calculation. KGB psychological profilers had advised him that CIA handlers would find romantic motivation more believable than ideological conversion, more consistent with known patterns of Soviet defection. On October 15, 1985, Yurchenko attended a meeting at FBI headquarters to identify photographs of suspected KGB officers operating in the United States. He examined 183 surveillance photographs, identifying 47 with certainty, and marking another 32 as possible matches. FBI counterintelligence considered the session a significant success, resulting in expanded surveillance operations against identified officers and diplomatic expulsions that would occur the following year. But Yurchenko also examined the photographs for a different purpose. He noted which KGB officers the FBI had photographed and which remained undetected. He memorized FBI surveillance techniques visible in the background details of the photos, the angles suggesting camera positions, the lighting indicating time of day, the locations revealing FBI operational priorities. This information, once he returned to Moscow, would allow the KGB to adjust its American operations, avoiding FBI coverage and protecting sources that remained uncompromised. The attaché case remained with him throughout this period, its contents uninspected. CIA security protocol required thorough examination of all defector possessions, but Director Casey had personally authorized exemption in Yurchenko's case. Casey believed that excessive security measures might offend a defector, providing voluntary cooperation, might suggest distrust that could undermine the developing relationship. The decision reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Casey thought he was managing a defector who needed reassurance, when he was actually hosting an intelligence officer executing a complex operation. Inside the case, in addition to the Minix photographs of KGB documents, Yurchenko had secured a more unusual form of insurance: detailed notes on CIA debriefing procedures, safehouse security measures, counterintelligence investigation methods, and personnel assessments of the officers handling his case. These notes, written in a personal shorthand on pages torn from a notebook he requested for personal journaling, documented American intelligence methods in granular detail. When he returned to Moscow, this operational intelligence would prove his continued loyalty to the KGB, despite his temporary defection, providing documentation of how deeply he had penetrated CIA operations from the inside. The turning point came on November 2, 1985, at Au Pied de Cochon, a French restaurant in Georgetown where Yurchenko was dining with CIA security officer Tom P. Rochford. The choice of restaurant had been Yurchenko's. He had developed a taste for Western cuisine during his months of defector luxury and requested opportunities to experience Washington's culinary options. Rochford, following standard protocol for defector management, agreed to the outing while maintaining covert backup surveillance from CIA officers positioned at nearby tables and in vehicles outside. At 7:43 p.m., Yurchenko excused himself to use the restroom. Rochford, in testimony given during the subsequent CIA damage assessment investigation, reported that Yurchenko appeared calm, showed no signs of agitation or unusual behavior, and had been discussing with apparent interest his upcoming polygraph examination and his desire to visit California. The conversation had been pleasant, unremarkable, consistent with 3 months of growing rapport between handler and defector. But Yurchenko didn't use the restroom. He walked through the restaurant's kitchen, a route he had carefully observed during 2 previous visits to the establishment, exited through a service entrance, and entered a taxi that happened to be discharging passengers at that moment. In Russian, he told the driver to take him to the Soviet embassy. The driver, a recent immigrant from Ukraine named Mikhail Jitnikov, would later tell Washington Post reporters that he thought the man was drunk, that he appeared agitated but determined, that he offered extra payment for speed. Rochford waited 12 minutes before becoming concerned. Standard protocol allowed defectors reasonable privacy, but 12 minutes exceeded normal parameters. He approached the restroom, found it empty, initiated emergency procedures. CIA backup surveillance teams mobilized immediately, checking all exits, questioning restaurant staff. By 8:02 p.m., they had determined Yurchenko had left the building. By 8:15 p.m., they had identified the taxi through witness interviews. By 8:47 p.m., they had traced the taxi's destination to the Soviet embassy compound. The damage assessment began immediately. Emergency cables went to CIA stations worldwide, warning that a defector with comprehensive knowledge of American counterintelligence methods had returned to Soviet control. Operations Yurchenko had been briefed on underwent emergency suspension. Sources he had learned about received warning signals to cease activity pending security review. The FBI launched investigations into whether Yurchenko had made unauthorized contact with Soviet intelligence during his 3 months of American custody, whether his defection had been a KGB operation from the beginning, whether American intelligence had been completely deceived. Inside the Soviet embassy, Yurchenko met with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and KGB resident Stanislav Androsov. Declassified KGB cables from that evening, released into 2005, record the conversation. Yurchenko reported that his defection had been coerced, that CIA officers had drugged him in Rome and transported him against his will to the United States, that he had been held prisoner for 3 months and subjected to psychological torture. He claimed he had provided no genuine intelligence, that everything he told American debriefers was disinformation prepared in advance, that his escape represented an intelligence victory rather than a security failure. Androsov, skeptical of this account, pressed for details. The cable notes. Y provided specific information on CIA debriefing procedures, safe house locations, security measures, described in detail the officers handling his case, their personalities and vulnerabilities, claimed to have maintained control throughout operation. When asked about provided intelligence on redacted and redacted, Y stated these were sacrifices authorized by Center for Greater Operational Objective. Explanations satisfied resident concerns regarding Y's loyalty. The Greater Operational Objective remained classified in the released documents, but CIA analysts who studied the cables concluded that Yurchenko had convinced Moscow he had successfully executed a false defection operation, that he had volunteered to appear to defect, provided authorized intelligence to establish credibility, and returned with detailed intelligence on American counterintelligence methods that offset the intelligence he had revealed. Whether KGB leadership actually believed this narrative remains disputed among intelligence historians. Some argue that Moscow accepted Yurchenko's story because it served internal political purposes, that admitting a senior officer had genuinely defected would have created unacceptable damage to KGB prestige and triggered another destructive round of internal security investigations. By framing his defection as a controlled operation, The KGB could claim intelligence victory rather than admit catastrophic loss. Others contend that Moscow saw through Yurchenko's deception but chose to accept him back anyway, recognizing that he had protected deeper sources and that his return might sow confusion within American intelligence about whether his defection had been genuine or orchestrated. The ambiguity served Soviet interests regardless of the truth. On November 4th, 1985, 2 days after entering the Soviet embassy, Yurchenko appeared at a press conference arranged by Soviet officials. He sat at a table in the embassy's formal reception room, flanked by Ambassador Dobrynin and First Secretary Vitaly Churkin. He read from a prepared statement, speaking in English with the accent he had refined during years of American postings. I was forcibly abducted by American intelligence officers in Rome on August 1st, 1985. I was drugged and transported against my will to the United States. For 3 months, I was held prisoner and subjected to psychological pressure intended to force me to denounce my country and provide false information about Soviet intelligence activities. I refused to cooperate with these criminal acts. I escaped from my captors on November 2nd and sought refuge in the Soviet embassy. I demand that the United States government acknowledge this kidnapping and apologize for this violation of international law. I intend to return to the Soviet Union, to my family, and to my duties. American journalists at the press conference, familiar with defection narratives from years of Cold War coverage, peppered Yurchenko with questions. Had he been tortured? No, but psychological pressure constituted torture. Had he provided any information? Only disinformation designed to mislead American intelligence. Did he regret his time in American custody? He regretted that his government had been forced to expend resources on recovering him from an illegal kidnapping. The performance convinced no one, but achieved its purpose. By claiming coercion rather than voluntary defection, Yurchenko created plausible deniability for himself and the KGB. The CIA couldn't definitively prove he had defected voluntarily, couldn't conclusively demonstrate that his intelligence had been genuine rather than disinformation, couldn't eliminate the possibility that his entire 3-month American sojourn had served Soviet objectives. What Yurchenko said privately, away from microphones and cameras, emerged from KGB officers who later defected themselves. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who defected to Britain in 1985 and provided extensive debriefings on Soviet intelligence operations, reported in his 1990 memoir that Yurchenko had admitted to KGB colleagues that his defection had been genuine but opportunistic, that he had planned to profit from temporary cooperation with American intelligence, then return to Moscow with intelligence that would protect him from prosecution. Gordievsky wrote, Yurchenko told intimates that he had played both sides, that he had given the Americans information they would have eventually discovered while withholding intelligence that maintained his value to Moscow. He believed he had executed the perfect intelligence operation: brief defection, limited damage, successful return. But Yurchenko's perfect operation had a flaw he hadn't anticipated: the attaché case. When CIA security officers searched his abandoned safehouse room after his escape, they found the case sitting on a dresser, apparently forgotten in his rush to leave. Inside, they discovered the Minix photographs of KGB documents and the detailed notes on American intelligence methods. The discovery created immediate confusion. Why would a KGB officer executing a controlled false defection leave behind documentation that proved he had stolen classified Soviet materials? Why would he abandon notes that demonstrated his spying on American intelligence procedures? CIA analysts proposed several theories. He had forgotten the case in the urgency of his escape. He had deliberately left it as a final gesture of betrayal against Moscow. The case had been compromised somehow, and he chose to abandon it rather than risk carrying it into the embassy. A fourth possibility emerged from CIA counterintelligence analysis completed in January 1986. Yurchenko had intended to return carrying the case, but had been surprised by unexpected circumstances that forced him to leave without it. The most likely explanation for those circumstances came from surveillance of the Soviet embassy compound in the days following Yurchenko's return. NSA signals intelligence intercepts, declassified in 2011, captured communications between the embassy and KGB headquarters in Moscow during the 72 hours after Yurchenko's arrival. The intercepts, partially redacted, indicate that Moscow ordered immediate return transportation for Yurchenko, but specified that he should undergo preliminary debriefing in Washington before departure. The debriefing, conducted by KGB counterintelligence specialists who flew from Moscow to Washington, included polygraph examination using Soviet equipment transported through diplomatic channels. The polygraph examination occurred on November 3, 1985, in a secure room in the embassy basement. KGB protocols for polygraphing potentially compromised officers involved questions about unauthorized contact with hostile services, about personal motivations for defection, about withheld information. The examination lasted 4 hours. Results were transmitted to Moscow via encrypted cable. Yurchenko failed. The cable reporting the results, declassified in 2011, notes, subject displayed deceptive response patterns on questions regarding completeness of defection, motivation, regarding retention of Soviet classified materials, regarding contacts with CIA officers beyond officially reported debriefing sessions. Recommend enhanced debriefing protocol before permitting return to Moscow Center. The enhanced debriefing would have involved intensive interrogation, possible detention, certainly delays that would have given Yurchenko opportunity to retrieve the attaché case from the safe house. But Yurchenko convinced his interrogators that his deceptive responses stemmed from stress and lingering effects of alleged CIA drugging rather than genuine deception. He persuaded them that immediate return to Moscow would serve KGB interests better than extended Washington debriefing, that his intelligence on American counterintelligence methods needed urgent dissemination to field officers who might be compromised. On November 6, 1985, 4 days after his restaurant escape, Yurchenko boarded an Aeroflot flight from Washington Dulles to Moscow, accompanied by 2 KGB security officers. He traveled without the attaché case, which remained in CIA custody undergoing forensic analysis that would reveal its contents and their implications. The revelation of what Yurchenko had actually done, the theft of KGB documents, the spying on American intelligence, the double game against both superpowers, emerged gradually through intelligence channels that remained classified for decades. The CIA initially treated Yurchenko's defection as a counterintelligence disaster, a failure of security that allowed a KGB officer to penetrate American debriefing operations and return to Moscow with sensitive intelligence on CIA methods. Congressional oversight committees conducted investigations. Officers involved in Yurchenko's handling faced career consequences. Thomas Hanna, Yurchenko's primary handler, received a formal reprimand for insufficient skepticism regarding the defector's credibility. In testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in January 1986, Hanna defended his approach. We had no indication that Yurchenko intended to return to Soviet control. His intelligence on the Howard and Pelton cases proved accurate and actionable. His emotional state suggested genuine psychological trauma, consistent with defection stress. The decision to grant him relative freedom reflected best practices in defector management developed over 30 years of Cold War intelligence operations. Colin Thompson, who had advocated for more intensive security measures, received commendation for his analytical skepticism, but no change in assignment. He continued working Soviet counterintelligence for the CIA until his retirement in 1994. In a 2003 interview with intelligence historians, Thompson reflected on the Yurchenko case. We wanted so badly to believe we had scored a victory that we ignored warning signs. The leather case should have been searched immediately. The gaps in his intelligence should have triggered more aggressive interrogation. We let operational enthusiasm override counterintelligence discipline. Director Casey, questioned about the case by congressional committees, maintained that Yurchenko had provided valuable intelligence that justified the operational approach. The Howard and Pelton cases resulted in arrests and prosecutions. FBI counterintelligence gained insight into KGB methods that improved American security. Casey argued that even if Yurchenko had ultimately returned to Moscow, the intelligence gained during his 3-month cooperation provided net benefit to American interests. But the discovery of the attaché case's contents complicated this assessment. CIA analysts examining the Minox photographs found documentation of KGB operations that Yurchenko had never mentioned during his debriefings. Operations in Western Europe, deep cover illegals in Canada, financial networks supporting Soviet intelligence activities in Latin America. The photographs proved that Yurchenko had possessed intelligence far more valuable than what he had provided, that he had systematically withheld information while appearing to cooperate fully. More disturbing were the notes on American intelligence methods. Detailed observations on CIA security procedures, personality assessments of American officers, analysis of FBI counterintelligence techniques. Yurchenko had been studying his captors as thoroughly as they had been debriefing him, gathering intelligence that would benefit KGB operations for years. The CIA counterintelligence staff convened a special task force to assess the damage. Their classified report, partially declassified in 2008, concluded, Yurchenko operation represents sophisticated KGB exploitation of American intelligence community's desire for high-level defections. Subject provided limited genuine intelligence to establish credibility, withheld more valuable intelligence for potential future leverage, and gathered extensive operational intelligence on American counterintelligence methods. His return to Moscow likely was planned from beginning, with defection serving as vehicle for intelligence collection against CIA. Recommend complete review of defector handling procedures and enhanced security measures for future high-value defectors. The review led to significant changes in CIA protocol. Future defectors would undergo more intensive security screening. Personal possessions would be searched thoroughly, regardless of apparent sensitivity. Debriefing sessions would include more sophisticated validation of provided intelligence. The Yurchenko case became a teaching example at CIA training facilities, studied as an illustration of how intelligence officers could exploit Western assumptions and procedures. But what happened to Yurchenko himself remained unclear for years. Soviet media reported his return to Moscow with minimal coverage, describing him as a diplomat who had been kidnapped and subsequently rescued. KGB sources indicated he had resumed work in intelligence, though in what capacity remained classified. Rumors circulated among intelligence professionals that he had been executed for unauthorized defection, that he had been imprisoned for compromising operations, that he had been rewarded for successful penetration of CIA. The truth emerged through a series of defector reports and documentary releases spanning 2 decades. Yurchenko did return to KGB duty, but in a diminished capacity. He was assigned to training duties at the Red Banner Institute, teaching young intelligence officers about Western counterintelligence methods, the same methods he had studied during his American sojourn. His knowledge proved valuable for preparing officers being posted to Western capitals, helping them understand and evade FBI and CIA surveillance. But Yurchenko's career never recovered its former trajectory. The cloud of suspicion surrounding his defection, was it genuine? Was it controlled? Was it something in between? Prevented his return to operational positions. KGB colleagues treated him with professional courtesy, but personal distance. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had lived in the West and returned, had breathed air that smelled of betrayal, even if his loyalty could be technically defended. Oleg Kalugin, a KGB general who defected to the United States in 1995, provided the most detailed account of Yurchenko's post-defection status. In his memoir, The First Directorate, Kalugin wrote, Vitaly Yurchenko became a ghost in the KGB. He walked the hallways, taught his classes, attended meetings, but everyone knew he had been contaminated by the West. Whether he had actually intended to defect permanently or had executed some brilliant operation didn't matter. He had lived among Americans, eaten their food, watched their television, breathed their freedom. That experience marked him as unreliable in ways that transcended any intelligence he might have gathered. The KGB used him, but never trusted him again. The question of what Yurchenko had ultimately accomplished, for himself, for the KGB, for anyone, remained contested among intelligence professionals. Had he successfully played both sides, extracting benefit from temporary defection while maintaining enough loyalty to secure his return? Had he been a genuine defector who lost his nerve and attempted to salvage his situation through deception? Had the entire episode served Soviet intelligence objectives in ways not yet fully understood? Documents declassified in 2017 by the Russian Federation's Federal Security Service, FSB, successor to the KGB, shed new light on these questions. Among the released materials was a 1986 internal KGB assessment of the Yurchenko operation, authored by First Deputy Chairman Grushko. The assessment, marked Top Secret Special Importance, evaluated Yurchenko's defection and return in the context of KGB strategic objectives. The Yurchenko operation achieved several objectives despite its unconventional execution. The sacrifice of compromised assets, Howard and Pelton, proceeded as authorized, successfully convincing CIA of subjects' genuine defection. Subjects' collection of intelligence on American counterintelligence methods, particularly FBI surveillance techniques and CIA defector handling procedures, provides significant operational value. Subjects' demonstrated ability to penetrate CIA security while maintaining appearance of cooperation offers useful model for future operations. However, subjects' psychological instability and emotional motivations created unacceptable operational risk. His unauthorized defection, regardless of subsequent claims about planned operation, violated fundamental security protocols and demonstrated lack of discipline. His failure to retrieve critical materials, the attaché case, before extraction represents serious operational failure that compromised sensitive documentation and exposed his intelligence collection against American services. Recommendation: utilize subjects' knowledge for training purposes only. Do not assign to operational duties requiring security clearance. Consider subject permanently compromised for sensitive work, regardless of his stated loyalty or provided intelligence. Monitor for signs of continued Western contact or psychological deterioration. The assessment reveals that Moscow viewed Yurchenko as operationally useful but personally compromised, a source of valuable intelligence about American counterintelligence methods, but too unstable for future operational deployment. His defection, even if partially successful from KGB perspective, had destroyed his career as an intelligence officer. Yurchenko remained in training duties until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the KGB underwent reorganization into the FSB. He retired with the rank of colonel, a respectable but not distinguished conclusion to a career that had once promised higher achievement. He lived in Moscow, receiving a government pension, occasionally appearing at KGB veterans gatherings where he was treated with polite awkwardness by colleagues who never quite knew what to make of his American adventure. In 2002, journalist David Wise tracked down Yurchenko for an interview, one of the few Western contacts he granted. Wise found him living in a modest Moscow apartment, drinking vodka, bitter about his treatment by both the CIA and KGB. Yurchenko refused to clarify whether his defection had been genuine or staged, whether he had planned to return from the beginning or had changed his mind in Georgetown. "Everyone believes what they want to believe," he told Wise. "The Americans think I deceived them. The KGB thought I betrayed them. The truth is, I tried to create a better situation for myself and ended up with nothing." When Wise asked about the attaché case, about the documents and notes left behind, Yurchenko smiled, but said nothing. The smile suggested regret, or perhaps pride in an operation that almost worked, or perhaps resignation that his most carefully planned intelligence operation had ended with documentary evidence abandoned in a Virginia safe house. Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko died on December 21, 2002, at age 66, from complications of liver disease. Russian intelligence services arranged a modest funeral, attended by a handful of former KGB colleagues and his daughter. Western media gave his death minimal coverage, a short obituary in the Washington Post, a paragraph in the New York Times noting his 1985 defection and return. The CIA's classified archives contain thousands of pages of documentation on his case, most still restricted from public release. The lasting impact of the Yurchenko case extended far beyond the career of one troubled intelligence officer. His defection and return exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in American counterintelligence, while simultaneously revealing the limits of Soviet intelligence operations. Both superpowers learned lessons that shaped intelligence practices for the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. For the CIA, Yurchenko demonstrated that high-level defections could serve hostile intelligence purposes even when they appeared genuine. The agency implemented new security protocols for handling defectors, including more intensive background investigation, enhanced psychological evaluation, and stricter controls on defector access to sensitive information. The assumption that defectors who provided valuable intelligence were necessarily loyal underwent significant revision. Trust, previously granted based on intelligence provided, now required continuous validation through multiple indicators. The Howard and Pelton cases, revealed through Yurchenko's intelligence, triggered the most extensive counterintelligence review in CIA history. The fact that a KGB officer had possessed information about deep penetrations of American intelligence suggested that Soviet intelligence had comprehensive knowledge of CIA operations that exceeded American understanding of KGB penetrations. The review identified systemic security weaknesses, including inadequate screening of personnel with access to sensitive intelligence, insufficient monitoring of employees showing signs of financial or psychological stress, and lack of coordination between CIA and FBI on counterintelligence matters. Congress responded with increased oversight and funding for counterintelligence operations. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence conducted extensive hearings on the CIA's handling of the Yurchenko defection, ultimately recommending structural changes to how the agency managed defectors and assessed their credibility. The hearings, partially declassified in 1995, revealed internal CIA divisions about Yurchenko's motivation and loyalty that had never been fully resolved during his time in American custody. For the KGB, Yurchenko's operation, however it was truly conceived, demonstrated both the possibilities and risks of false defection operations. The intelligence he gathered on American counterintelligence methods provided tactical value for protecting Soviet operations in the West. His identification of FBI surveillance techniques allowed KGB officers in the United States to modify their tradecraft, avoiding detection during critical operations. The photographs from his attaché case, which the CIA never recovered, documented aspects of Western intelligence operations that Moscow had been unable to penetrate through traditional means. But Yurchenko's psychological instability and his abandonment of critical materials demonstrated the inherent risks of operations that relied on individual initiative and emotional manipulation. KGB leadership concluded that false defection operations required more careful preparation, more comprehensive psychological evaluation, and more robust extraction planning. The service became more cautious about authorizing such operations, recognizing that the intelligence gained might not justify the risk of losing an officer to genuine defection or compromising operations through incomplete execution. The technology of intelligence operations also evolved in response to the Yurchenko case. The CIA invested heavily in new polygraph techniques designed to detect sophisticated deception by trained intelligence officers. The agency developed enhanced psychological assessment tools, including stress analysis and behavioral profiling systems that could identify patterns consistent with false defection. Document authentication procedures became more sophisticated, with forensic analysis capable of detecting the kind of selective document theft Yurchenko had perpetrated. The KGB similarly upgraded its technical capabilities, developing better methods for preparing officers assigned to deep cover Western operations, including resistance to American interrogation techniques and methods for maintaining cover under intensive questioning. The service also enhanced its extraction procedures, recognizing that Yurchenko's failure to retrieve his critical materials had compromised the operation's intelligence value. On a human level, the Yurchenko case reinforced a Cold War reality that intelligence professionals on both sides understood, but rarely acknowledged. That loyalty, betrayal, truth, and deception existed in a state of permanent ambiguity, where certainty was impossible, and every statement carried multiple potential meanings. Officers who had worked the case found themselves unable to definitively answer what had actually happened. Was Yurchenko a defector who changed his mind? A loyal KGB officer executing an authorized operation? Or something more complex that resisted simple categorization? Thomas Hanna, reflecting on the case in a 2010 interview after his retirement, expressed this ambiguity. "I spent months with Yurchenko, probably 100 hours of face-to-face conversation. I still don't know what motivated him. He seemed genuinely disillusioned with Soviet system, genuinely in love with the woman he claimed drove him to defect, genuinely cooperative in providing intelligence. But he also held back information, maintained careful control over his personal effects, and ultimately returned to Moscow. Was he performing brilliantly, or did he start out genuine and change his mind? I've spent 30 years thinking about it, and I'm no closer to an answer." The case influenced Cold War strategy at the highest levels. The Reagan administration, briefed extensively on Yurchenko's defection and return, became more skeptical of intelligence, suggesting Soviet vulnerabilities or opportunities for American exploitation. The sense that Soviet intelligence might be running sophisticated deception operations created caution in strategic planning, with military and diplomatic officials questioning whether apparent Soviet weaknesses might actually be elements of elaborate deception. This skepticism contributed to more careful American approach to arms control negotiations in the late 1980s. U.S. negotiators, aware that Soviet intelligence possessed detailed knowledge of American positions through penetrations that might not yet be discovered, adopted more defensive negotiating strategies. The assumption that Moscow knew American intentions and capabilities became embedded in strategic planning, influencing everything from weapons deployment decisions to diplomatic signaling. Ironically, this increased caution may have contributed to more stable superpower relations in the final years of the Cold War. Both sides, aware of mutual penetration and uncertain about what the other truly knew, became more careful about actions that might be misinterpreted or that might reveal intelligence capabilities. The opacity created by cases like Yurchenko's forced both American and Soviet leadership to communicate more directly through diplomatic channels, reducing reliance on intelligence assessments that might be compromised. The case also affected individual lives in ways that rippled through both intelligence communities. CIA officers who had worked with Yurchenko faced career impacts ranging from reprimands to early retirement. Some left intelligence work entirely, disillusioned by the failure to correctly assess Yurchenko's intentions. Others remained, but carried forward enhanced skepticism about defectors and source credibility that influenced their work for decades. On the Soviet side, KGB officers aware of Yurchenko's operation, genuine or staged, learned to view defection with more complex understanding. The case demonstrated that officers might defect for reasons unrelated to ideology, might return for reasons unrelated to loyalty, and might serve intelligence purposes in ways that transcended simple categories of betrayal or loyalty. This sophistication in understanding human motivation influenced KGB approach to recruiting Western sources, with less emphasis on ideological conversion and more focus on exploiting personal vulnerabilities, financial pressures, and emotional needs. The material in Yurchenko's attaché case, analyzed by CIA technical specialists over months of intensive study, revealed broader patterns about KGB operations that influenced American counterintelligence for years. The photographs documented operational techniques, communications protocols, and organizational structures that allowed FBI and CIA to better understand how Soviet intelligence functioned. This knowledge contributed to successful operations against KGB networks in the late 1980s, including the arrest of several Soviet illegals operating under deep cover in the United States, and the exposure of KGB surveillance operations that had previously gone undetected. But the photographs also revealed how much the Soviets knew about Western intelligence. Some of the documents Yurchenko had photographed described CIA operations with accuracy that suggested KGB penetrations that remained unidentified. This discovery triggered additional counterintelligence investigations that continued into the 1990s, ultimately contributing to the identification of CIA officer Aldrich Ames as a Soviet source in 1994. The Ames case revealed that throughout Yurchenko's defection, the KGB had possessed a highly placed source within CIA counterintelligence who provided comprehensive intelligence on American operations, intelligence that may have informed Moscow's handling of the Yurchenko situation. The connection between Yurchenko and Ames cases illustrated a broader pattern. Soviet intelligence had achieved penetrations of American services that were deeper and more damaging than U.S. leadership had understood in 1985. Yurchenko's operation, whether planned or opportunistic, had occurred against a backdrop of comprehensive KGB knowledge about CIA operations. This context suggested that Moscow's calculation about allowing Yurchenko to defect temporarily, or its willingness to accept him back after genuine defection, had been informed by confidence that deeper sources remained protected. In the decades after Yurchenko's death, historians and intelligence professionals continued to debate what his case revealed about Cold War intelligence operations. Some viewed him as a tragic figure, caught between competing loyalties and personal desires, who tried to create space for himself in a rigid system that allowed no middle ground. Others saw him as a skilled operator who nearly pulled off a sophisticated intelligence operation, foiled only by the accident of leaving behind critical materials. Still others considered him a symptom of systemic problems in both American and Soviet intelligence. Operational cultures that prioritized tactical advantage over human reality, that treated intelligence officers as resources rather than people, that created pressures impossible to sustain over careers spanning decades. The case influenced thinking about intelligence reform in both Russia and the United States. When Russian intelligence services underwent reorganization after the Soviet collapse, Yurchenko's case was studied as an example of how rigid operational security could create pressure that drove officers to desperate measures. American intelligence reform discussions in the 1990s and 2000s similarly referenced Yurchenko when examining problems with defector handling and counterintelligence procedures. The attaché case sits now in a secure CIA storage facility somewhere in the Virginia countryside, cataloged with a classification that ensures it will not be publicly accessible for decades to come. Inside remain the Minix photographs Yurchenko took in Moscow KGB headquarters during spring 1985, the notebook pages recording his observations of American intelligence methods, and a single personal letter, never opened by CIA analysts because it appeared to be addressed to Svetlana Dedkova and was deemed outside operational scope. That letter, its contents unknown, represents the one element of the Yurchenko case that remains genuinely mysterious. Was it actually addressed to Svetlana, or did it contain final instructions, or operational notes, or something else entirely? Did Yurchenko intend to deliver it before his return to Moscow, or was it insurance kept against uncertain future, or simply a genuine letter to the woman whose rejection he claimed drove his defection? The CIA officer who first examined the attaché case in November 1985, cataloging its contents with clinical precision, noted the letter's existence in his report, but made no effort to open or read it. Professional respect for personal privacy, even a defector's privacy, dictated that an apparently personal letter remain sealed unless operational necessity required otherwise. No such necessity ever arose. The letter remained sealed, its contents speculative. This single sealed letter, sitting in a locked case in a classified storage facility, represents something larger than its physical contents. It symbolizes the fundamental unknowability at the heart of intelligence operations, the fact that human motivation resists complete analysis. that even comprehensive intelligence collection leaves gaps, that certainty remains forever elusive when dealing with individuals operating under extreme pressure in morally ambiguous circumstances. Yurchenko's case taught both American and Soviet intelligence services that people contain contradictions that transcend operational categorization. He could have been simultaneously a loyal KGB officer and a man desperate to escape his life. He could have genuinely loved Svetlana, while also using that love as operational cover. He could have intended to return to Moscow, while also genuinely providing intelligence to the CIA. Human complexity allows for multiple truths that exist in tension rather than canceling each other out. The leather attaché case, like the man who carried it for 16 days across Europe and into 3 months of American custody, exists now in a state of permanent ambiguity. It contains evidence, but not conclusions, documentation, but not truth, materials that answer some questions while creating others more profound. It serves as a physical reminder that intelligence operations, for all their technical sophistication and analytical rigor, ultimately depend on understanding human beings, a task that remains impossibly difficult, even when every word is recorded, every movement tracked, every decision analyzed. Whether Yurchenko succeeded or failed, whether he won or lost, whether his operation achieved its objectives or foundered on execution error. These questions resist definitive answer even with decades of retrospective analysis and document declassification. The case remains open in the most important sense. Open to interpretation, open to revision, open to the possibility that the truth includes elements none of the participants fully understood at the time, and historians may never fully reconstruct from available evidence. In the end, Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko delivered top-secret KGB files to the CIA, then made a choice no one expected. Not his handlers, not his colleagues, possibly not even himself until the moment he walked out of that Georgetown restaurant into November rain. The choice was neither simple betrayal nor straightforward loyalty, neither pure defection nor clean return, but something more complex that revealed the ambiguity inherent in all intelligence operations, where human beings serve as both instruments and actors, sources and subjects, players and played. The attaché case remains sealed, waiting in darkness for historians or analysts who may someday have clearance and purpose to examine its contents more thoroughly. The letter inside remains unread, its words unknown, its significance uncertain. Like the man who wrote it, like the operation he conducted, like the intelligence services that sought to understand and control him, it represents a truth that resists complete revelation. Evidence that even in the documented, analyzed, declassified world of Cold War intelligence, mystery persists, ambiguity endures, and certainty remains forever out of reach.